Aaron shall put on the holy linen coat, and he shall have the linen breeches upon his flesh. And he shall be girded with a linen girdle, and with the linen mitre shall he be attired. These are holy garments. Therefore shall he wash his flesh in water, and so put them on. And thou shalt make holy garments for Aaron thy brother, for glory and for beauty. And thou shalt speak unto all that are wise-hearted, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. Aaron, the brother of Moses, was the first high priest of Israel. He was only allowed access to the most holy place on the one special day of atonement. On that day, he was ceremonially dressed in a special outfit that the high priest wore for that occasion. The role of the priest was to serve as a mediator or go-between, so that the person who stood in need of God's help and support might receive it. The Bible makes it clear that God was far more in tune with the people's needs and concerns than they themselves were. And he cast out the spirits with his word, and healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of by Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities, and bare our sickness. The theme of man's redemption will be a subject that will never be exhausted throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity. Consider, if you will, the fact that God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-present everywhere at once. And yet somehow, this same God in heaven did not know what sin was personally, in the sense that he couldn't feel pain. He'd never been hungry or been sad and lonely. God couldn't understand what a life burdened by the curse of sin would be like until he came here as a man. As a son of Abraham, born in sinful flesh, Jesus experienced every aspect of our sinful human condition. But even more importantly, he tasted death for every man. Jesus experienced what the pain of sin's ultimate consequence will feel like in the day of God's wrath, because he willingly took that burden upon himself. In the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night of the Passover, when he drank the cup of woe. For 33.5 years, Jesus walked this earth as one of us. He experienced all of the trials and tribulations that we have to face every single day, because he experienced what it's like for us who live and die under the curse of the cancer that is sin. Seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. No one but Christ can stand as the intercessor between God and man, because no one is more qualified than he in identifying with us in our time of need. And there will be no greater need than the one that the saints will face when they will be confronted by the wrath of God during the time of trouble. Therefore, under the terms of the covenant, the high priest's garments were designed to explain what his unique qualifications would be for his most exalted status. As our great high priest, he must address the specific needs and concerns that only the mediator of the new covenant would be familiar with. His wardrobe consisted of a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, an embroidered coat, a mitre, and a girdle. And they shall make holy garments for Aaron thy brother, and his sons, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office. And thou shalt take 2 onyx stones, and grave on them the names of the children of Israel, 6 of their names on one stone, and the other 6 stones of the rest on the other stone, according to their birth, with the work of an engraver in stone, like the engravings of a signet. Thou shalt engrave the 2 stones with the names of the children of Israel. Thou shalt make them to be set in ouches of gold, and thou shalt put the 2 stones upon the shoulders of the ephod for stones of memorial unto the children of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord upon his 2 shoulders for a memorial. And beneath, upon the hem of the blue robe, thou shalt make pomegranates of blue, and of purple, and of scarlet, round about the hem thereof, and bells of gold between them round about, a golden bell and a pomegranate, a golden bell and a pomegranate, upon the hem of the robe round about. Thou shalt make holy garments for Aaron thy brother, for glory and for beauty. God said Aaron's garments were made for glory. The term glory explains what the high priest's purpose would ultimately be, while the term for beauty explains what he would ultimately achieve as the mediator of the new covenant. From head to toe, the high priest's garments were an explanation of God's plan to finish the plan of redemption. We understand that the mitre was a reference to Matthew 5 and verse 36, which referred to Christ's promise to fulfill the terms of the everlasting covenant. The priest's mitre was a reference to the silver head of the pillar of the courtyard. No matter who the high priest was, wearing the mitre meant his head would be white, because the white head represented Christ's head of hair that had turned from black to white, as a sign that he had kept his promise to redeem the world from sin. In Exodus 29 and verse 6, the Lord said, Thou shalt put the mitre upon his head, and put the holy crown upon the mitre. The crown on the base of the mitre and the gold plate over the priest's forehead both represent the Lord's victory of faith that he did achieve as man's Redeemer. Both the crown and the golden plate represent the sealing of the saints and their victory of faith that they will receive according to the prophecy of Revelation 7. The priest's white linen robe represented the righteousness of Christ. As the Son of God, Christ's obedience of faith was perfected by virtue of his having suffered, even unto the death of the cross. The high priest's blue coat represented the burden of the sin of rebellion, which is an appropriate symbol for this world's condition, which has lasted for 6,000 years. The blue robe covered the white linen of his righteous character, which again signifies how great the extent of the rebellion has been. The shorter embroidered coat, or ephod, that the high priest wore specifically addressed the sins of God's covenant people, Israel. It was embroidered with the same 3 symbolic colors that decorated all 3 veils of the tabernacle. Worn over the priest's blue robe, it was his coat of many colors, because it was designed to remind Israel of Joseph, the son of Israel. The ephod that the high priest wore referred to the coat of many colors that Joseph wore. As this diagram shows, Joseph was a type of Christ, whose story was a prophecy of the Messiah. Joseph was God's faithful servant who saved his family and the whole world from 7 years of famine and hunger. Joseph interpreted the king's dream and was graciously rewarded when Pharaoh gave him the land of Goshen, which was a metaphor of heaven. The 7 years of famine exhausted all of the resources that the people had, such that no one had any more money to buy bread with. No one could buy or sell unless they came to Joseph, who, having gained the favor of the king, controlled the supply of grain. The girdle around the high priest's waist was also embroidered with the same 4 colors of red, blue, purple, and gold. It was the alpha of the golden girdle that John saw Jesus wearing in Revelation 1 and verse 13. Christ's golden girdle in Revelation brings to mind the word of the Lord that says, "But with righteousness shall he judge the poor, and reprove with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. And righteousness shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his reins." Isaiah 11 verses 4 and 5 explain the meaning of the multicolored belt that the high priest wore. In order for Christ to become the great judge that Isaiah describes, he would first have to endure the experience of carrying upon himself the sins of the world. In that sense, the latter explains the former, since the former was the prophecy of his suffering and death. The breastplate had 12 different gemstones that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. Each gemstone had a tribe's name inscribed on it. In Revelation 21, these 12 gemstones are the foundations of the wall of the New Jerusalem. The stones on the breastplate were a symbol of the high priest's burden that was literally on his heart. In Matthew 6 and verse 21, the Lord said, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." The high priest's treasure was literally a collection of 12 precious gemstones mounted on a solid gold plate, each stone having its own name, its own peculiar quality, and its own unique value. The stones on the breastplate were a symbol of the burden on Christ's heart, which is the victory of the saints. That explains why the gemstones in the breastplate just happen to be the names of the 12 gates to the city, the New Jerusalem, which is another symbol of the kingdom of heaven. The Urim and the Thummim that rested on the shoulders of the high priest were a reference to Isaiah 9 verses 6 and 7. The Bible says, "For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." The government Isaiah refers to is the hierarchy that we saw earlier in Exodus 18 and 28. What's most interesting about these 2 stones is the fact that they divide Israel into 2 parts, which was Israel's fate when the 2 sons of Solomon divided the nation of Israel into 2 parts. Rehoboam ruled over the cities of Judah in the south, while Jeroboam ruled over the cities of Israel in the north. In symbolic terms, both the 2 stones and the history of the 2 kingdoms represent the judgment process that will take place when Christ divides the world into 2 parts, having the sheep on his right hand and the goats on his left. The hem of bells and pomegranates on the high priest's blue robe is a reference to the commandment the Lord gave Israel in Numbers 15 and verse 38. The tzitzits, or tassels, that hung as fringes from the hem of the people's garments were a warning to Israel concerning her fate as a rebellious nation. Over time, the hem of a garment would unravel from the friction of rubbing the ground and from the shoes of one's feet while walking. The Lord used that illustration to make his point about the feet of Israel, which represents one's chosen path or destination. The fringe Being a mixture of blue and white was God making his point about the path of rebellion that Israel would take. The white thread of righteousness mixed with the blue thread of rebellion would cause the fabric of Israel as a nation to come apart or unravel. The kingdom of Israel in the north was taken into captivity by Assyria, while the kingdom of Judah was conquered by Babylon. Both kingdoms were overcome by a foreign power as punishment for having chosen the path of rebellion against God. That was the nation divided and conquered because of sin. The hem of the high priest's garment was different because of the 4 fruits, called pomegranates, that hung from it. Fruit always represents the end result of a growing process over a certain period of time. The hem of the high priest's garment was unprecedented in that it was only mentioned in the context of the high priest. The hem's pomegranates and golden bells were unique to the high priest and his office. They represented the love of God that came between each one of the 3 colors that stood for sin, rebellion, and idolatry. The hem of the high priest's garment was a reference to Christ, the great physician, according to Matthew 9 and verse 20 and Matthew 14 and verse 6. And behold, a woman which was diseased with an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the hem of his garment. For she said within herself, "If I may but touch his garment, I shall be whole." But Jesus turned him about, and when he saw her, he said, "Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole." And the woman was made whole from that hour. In Matthew 9, the afflicted woman was the nation of Israel. The issue of blood was her abuse of the ritual of sacrifice for sin, while her touching the hem of his garment was her recognizing both what had caused her affliction and the only remedy for her condition, precisely because the hem of Christ's garment explained what was the issue that had to be addressed. The woman reaching for the hem of Christ's garment meant she knew what the problem was and what it would take to be healed. The story was a prophecy of the church's victory of faith that would be realized by virtue of the cross. It was the promise that Israel would make the transition from Judaism to Christianity based on the lessons learned from the first Israel's failed covenant relationship. The arrangement of bells and pomegranates immediately brings to mind the same imagery that was the design of the innermost covering of the tabernacle. That imagery explained how the rift in heaven, which was represented as the blue loops of rebellion, was healed by the 50 gold clasps that represents God's love realized on the day of Pentecost. The gold clasps joined together the 2 halves of the angelic host that had been divided by Lucifer's rebellion in the beginning. In that same sense, the sound of the bells ringing on the hem of the high priest's robe was the signal that represented the good news, which was that God and man were being reconciled in the Day of Atonement. In ancient times, the bells produced a distinct sound that meant the time of the final atonement was taking place before the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place. The purpose of every ritual that was performed by a priest was God making the point that, as sinners, we cannot do what must be done in order to be saved. Someone who is qualified, being holy and anointed by God, would have to be the one that would do the work of saving us. In a word, the priest must be the one who would intercede with God on our behalf. He must be our intercessor and our advocate, because he would be the only one who can do what we, being sinful, never could. The vestments of the high priest were an object lesson that made the point. They explained what the work of redemption would involve concerning the final atonement. To understand the Day of Atonement and its sacrifices, we need to be clear about what God had said in the beginning concerning the difference that exists between the two types of atonement, because the two are very different. God said in the beginning what must be the difference between the daily sacrifice and the once only sacrifices that were offered on that very special day of judgment.